There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the drab clothing of a Tuesday afternoon or smell of something mundane, like motor oil and dust. You don't recognize them as pivotal until long after they've passed, when you're looking back over the landscape of your memory and see a single, towering landmark where you thought there was only flat, unremarkable terrain. For me, that landmark was built in the silence of Julian's garage, on a day that was no different from any other. It was a moment that began with a smear of grease on my wrist and ended with the solid, inexplicable pressure of his palm against my chest, right over my heart. It was a gesture that lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was the beginning of a tectonic shift, a slow, grinding movement of continents within me that would eventually remake my entire world. In that moment, the air didn't change, the angle of the sun through the dusty window didn't shift, but an invisible door I had long kept bolted and barred swung silently, irrevocably open. I just didn't know it yet. All I knew was the sudden, shocking warmth of his hand and the frantic, bird-like flutter of my own heart beneath it. It hadn't always been like this tightrope walk of unspoken things. For 3 years, Julian and I had existed in the comfortable, well-defined architecture of friendship. Our foundation was solid, built on the unlikely bedrock of my perpetually failing 1988 sedan and his almost magical ability to coax it back to life. I was a photographer, a man who lived in a world of quiet observation, of light and shadow and the captured stillness of a single moment. My hands were accustomed to the delicate machinery of a camera, the smooth coolness of a lens, the chemical scent of the darkroom. Julian's world was the opposite. It was a place of noise and force, of roaring engines and the percussive clang of metal on metal. His hands, broad and calloused, were fluent in a language of torque and combustion that I would never understand. They were perpetually mapped with a fine network of black grease, lines of hard work etched into his skin that no amount of industrial soap could ever fully erase. He was loud and bright, a supernova of easy laughter and casual confidence that drew people into his orbit effortlessly. I was a quiet planet, content in my own distant, steady path. The fact that our orbits had intersected at all felt like a happy accident of physics. I met him on a scorching July afternoon when my car had given up its ghost in the parking lot of a grocery store, sighing out a plume of steam in a final, dramatic act of surrender. I was stranded, frustrated, and sweating through my shirt. Julian's garage, Apex Auto, was just across the street, its wide bay doors gaping open like a hangar. I'd walked over, resigned to a bill I likely couldn't afford, and found him underneath a cherry-red pickup, a constellation of sparks showering down from a tool in his hand. He'd slid out on a creeper, wiping a forearm across his brow and leaving a streak of grease behind. His smile was immediate and disarming. He had a way of looking at you, a direct and open gaze, that made you feel like you were the only person in a crowded room. He listened to my tale of woe, nodding seriously, and then followed me across the asphalt to pronounce the sentence on my dying vehicle. A cracked radiator hose, he'd said, an easy fix. He had it patched and running within an hour, and when I asked him what I owed him, he just laughed. Call it a welcome to the neighborhood, he'd said, gesturing to the camera bag slung over my shoulder. Maybe you can take a decent photo of this rust bucket sometime. For the memories, that was the beginning. My car, in its infinite mechanical treachery, became our unwitting matchmaker. A faulty alternator 1 month, a worn-out belt the next. Each breakdown was a new excuse to spend an afternoon at his garage, watching him work. I'd sit on an overturned bucket, the smell of gasoline and hot metal thick in the air, and I'd photograph him. Not for any project, just for myself. I was fascinated by the contrast of his form against the hard geometry of the machines he commanded. The graceful efficiency of his movements, the focused line of his brow as he diagnosed a problem, the way the muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and released as he worked a stubborn bolt. He was utterly unself-conscious, and my camera loved him for it. I was documenting the physical grammar of competence, the sheer, unthinking grace of a man who was completely at home in his own body and his own world. He'd tease me about it, calling me his personal documentarian, but he never asked me to stop. Sometimes he'd ask to see the photos, and I'd show him the LCD screen. He'd study the images, a look of genuine surprise on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe that the man of focused intensity in the black and white frame was really him. "You make this dirty place look like art," he'd said once, and the quiet sincerity in his voice had made my chest ache. Our friendship spilled out of the garage and into the rest of our lives. We fell into an easy rhythm. Tuesdays became our unofficial dinner night, usually cheap pizza and cheaper beer at my apartment, arguing about movies or music. He'd help me hang heavy framed prints on my walls, his strength a perfect complement to my eye for composition. I'd help him write emails to difficult clients, my patience a balm for his quick temper. We were a study in contrasts that somehow, inexplicably, balanced. He filled the silences in my life with his easy chatter and laughter, and I offered him a quiet space where he didn't have to perform, where he could just be still. It was during these quiet moments, sitting on my worn leather couch with a movie humming in the background, that I began to understand the true nature of my feelings for him. It wasn't a sudden revelation, no lightning strike of clarity. It was more like a photograph developing slowly in a chemical bath, an image emerging gradually from the blankness, faint at first, then undeniable. The way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his forehead, the low, rumbling timbre of his laugh, the startling blue of his eyes when he was truly listening to you. I saw these details and I hoarded them, tiny treasures of observation that I kept locked away in the most guarded room of my heart. He had a girlfriend, Sarah. She was nice enough, a landscape architect who was as put together and organized as Julian was chaotic. They'd been together since college, their lives woven together in a way that seemed both comfortable and inevitable. I liked her truly, but I was also acutely, painfully aware of her presence, a constant, silent reminder of the boundaries that defined my friendship with Julian. When she was with us, he was different. Still my friend, but a version of him that was part of a pair. His hand would find her waist. His sentences would often start with "we," and the easy physical familiarity he sometimes showed me, a casual arm slung over my shoulders, a playful shove, was absent. I became an expert at navigating these moments, at maintaining a careful, friendly distance. I was the photographer, after all, the quiet observer. It was my role to stay on the outside of the frame, to document the scene without becoming a part of it. I told myself I was content with this arrangement. The friendship we had was too valuable, too rare, to risk on the foolishness of an impossible want. Loneliness was a familiar ache, a chronic condition I had learned to manage. Losing him entirely would be an acute, unbearable agony. So I built walls within myself, carefully constructed fortifications to keep my feelings contained. I learned to live with the low, constant hum of longing, to treat it as background noise, the ambient sound of my own life. The shift began subtly, a change in the emotional barometric pressure that only I seemed to notice. It started with the phone calls. Julian and Sarah had started fighting more, a fact he let slip not in a direct confession, but through the frayed edges of his voice during late-night calls. He never went into detail, and I never pressed. He'd just talk about his day at the shop, his words moving faster than usual, circling the real topic without ever landing on it. He was restless, an engine running too hot. I became his release valve, a place he could vent the pressure without having to name the source of the heat. I would listen, offering quiet affirmations, my apartment a sanctuary of calm transmitted through the phone line. I could picture him in his own space, a place he shared with Sarah that was filled with her carefully chosen furniture and organized shelves, and I knew why he was calling me. My apartment was neutral territory, a space that was solely and completely mine, and by extension, a space where he could feel solely and completely himself, untethered from the we that was starting to fray. Then came the breakup. He didn't call. He just appeared at my door one rainy Thursday night, long after midnight. He was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, his jacket dripping onto my hardwood floor. He looked hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside him and scooped out all the light and noise, leaving only a vast, echoing emptiness. He didn't say a word, just stood on my welcome mat, shivering. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I just stepped aside and let him in. He walked into my living room and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The sound he made wasn't a sob, not really. It was a raw, ragged exhalation of breath, the sound of a structure finally giving way under immense, prolonged strain. I draped a blanket over his shoulders and made him a cup of tea he didn't touch. We sat there for hours in near total silence, the only sounds the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window panes and the quiet hum of my refrigerator. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. I simply sat in the quiet darkness with him, a silent sentinel bearing witness to his grief. I was offering the only thing I had, my presence, a quiet, unwavering anchor in the storm that had just broken over his life. That night, something fundamental in our dynamic was altered. I was no longer just the friend, the observer. I had become a harbor, and he, for the first time, was a ship in desperate need of one. This was the beginning of the ritual. In the weeks that followed, my apartment became his default destination. He never called ahead. He would just appear, usually late, after the garage was closed and the city had grown quiet. He'd have the ghost of engine oil on his clothes and a weariness in his eyes that went bone deep. He said he couldn't stand the silence of his own place, a space now haunted by the absence of a life he had planned. My apartment, he said, was different. It was quiet, but it was a living quiet, filled with the gentle hum of my life, the smell of darkroom chemicals, the stacks of books, the soft music always playing in the background. It was a silence that soothed rather than oppressed. So he would come, and we would fall into a new, unspoken routine. We'd watch old movies, films I had seen a dozen times, their familiar plots a comforting, predictable landscape. At first, he would maintain a careful distance, sitting on the far end of the couch, a fortress of throw pillows between us. But as the nights wore on and exhaustion began to win its slow war against his pride, the space between us began to shrink. It was a slow, glacial creep, a territory ceded inch by painful inch. One night, a stray foot would rest against my calf. The next, his arm would be stretched out along the back of the couch, his fingers just brushing the hair on the nape of my neck. I cataloged each new breach of the boundary with a silent, frantic intensity. My body became a finely tuned instrument of awareness. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin when he was close. I could map the exact geography of our proximity. I could measure the dwindling inches between us as if with a surveyor's tools. Every nerve ending felt exposed, alive with a terrifying, exhilarating current of information. I would sit perfectly still, my breathing shallow, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, pretending to be absorbed in the film flickering on the screen. Inside, I was a mess of analysis and fear. What did this mean? Was it just the unconscious seeking of comfort from a grieving friend? Or was it something more? I was terrified of misinterpreting the signals, of seeing a message in the static, of mistaking a simple, platonic need for something that mirrored my own secret, desperate longing. To hope for more was to risk everything. So I remained still, a statue of feigned indifference, while a silent storm raged within me. The first time he fell asleep on me, it felt like a cataclysm. We were watching some black and white noir film, the dialogue a low murmur in the darkroom. I felt his head grow heavier and heavier against the back of the couch, and then, with a soft sigh, it tilted sideways and came to rest on my shoulder. He was instantly, deeply asleep. The weight of his head was both a profound burden and an impossible gift. It was solid, real, an anchor of trust that pinned me to the spot. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body screaming with tension. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my neck, a soft, rhythmic puff of air. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo mixed with the lingering, metallic tang of the garage. It was an intimacy so potent, so far beyond the established lines of our friendship, that it felt like I was holding a live wire. I was terrified to move, to even breathe, for fear of breaking the spell, of waking him and having to confront the reality of what was happening. So I sat there, motionless in the flickering blue light of the television, until my arm went numb and the credits rolled, letting the simple, profound weight of him be enough. The couch soon became an untenable fiction. He started staying over more nights than not, waking up stiff and groaning in the morning light, his back a roadmap of complaints from the lumpy cushions. I had a spare bedroom, a small, neat space with a comfortable bed that I used for storing camera equipment. I offered it to him, of course. It was the logical, sensible thing to do. He stood in the doorway of the room, looking in at the neatly made bed, and a strange, troubled expression crossed his face. "I don't know," he'd said, his voice quiet. "It's just so empty in there." The silence is louder. The unspoken request hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. I knew what he was asking for, and the implications of it sent a tremor of both terror and hope through me. My own bed was a queen, more than enough space for two people who were careful. My bedroom was not an empty, silent space. It was the heart of my apartment, the place where the quiet was the most lived in. My own hesitation lasted only a moment, a final, futile stand by the century of my self-preservation. "You can take the other side of my bed," I heard myself say, the words feeling like they belonged to someone far braver than I was. "If you want," he looked at me, his blue eyes searching my face for something, reassurance, permission, an escape clause. And then he gave a small, grateful nod. That first night was an exercise in exquisite torture. We were two separate islands in a vast sea of mattress, the blankets a carefully demarcated border between us. We lay on our backs, staring up at the ceiling, the darkness alive with everything we weren't saying. I was so acutely aware of him, of the sound of his breathing, of the warmth his body generated in the cool night air, that I felt I might vibrate apart. Sleep felt like an impossible goal. I was a cartographer of the space between us, mapping every shift of weight, every rustle of the sheets. I was convinced he could hear the frantic, traitorous beating of my own heart. But eventually, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Only then did I allow myself to relax, to unclench the muscles I hadn't even realized were coiled tight. Lying there in the dark, with him sleeping just a few feet away, I felt a strange and contradictory mix of emotions, a profound, aching loneliness, and a quiet, deeply resonant peace. He was here, in my room, in my bed. It was a fiction, a temporary arrangement born of his grief and my inability to say no. But for tonight, it was real, and it was more than I had ever allowed myself to hope for. The ritual evolved again. Proximity, it turns out, has its own gravitational pull. The space between us and the bed began to shrink, night by night. It started, as it always did, with plausible deniability. A cold night, a restless dream. He would turn over in his sleep, and an arm would be thrown across my waist, or his leg would tangle with mine beneath the covers. Each time it happened, I would lie awake, my body rigid, my mind racing. I would wait for him to wake up, to realize what he was doing and pull away with an embarrassed apology. But he never did. He would just sleep on, murmuring softly, pulling me closer in his unconscious search for warmth and comfort. He was seeking an anchor in the dark, and I had become it. My body was a source of solace for him, a warm, solid presence in the wreckage of his life. And for me, his touch was a slow, deliberate form of beautiful agony. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered under a guise that meant I could never truly have it. He was touching me, but he wasn't touching me. He was holding me, but he was holding onto a friend. To accept the comfort was to accept the fiction. To reject it was unthinkable. So I learned to live in the gray space. I learned to breathe through the moments when he would pull me flush against his chest in his sleep, his face buried in my hair, his legs tangled with mine. I learned to pretend that my heart wasn't trying to hammer its way out of my ribcage. I became an actor in the theater of our nights, playing the role of the unbothered, deeply sleeping friend. In the morning, we would wake up, often still wrapped around each other, and we would untangle ourselves with a careful, deliberate casualness. We never spoke of it. We would talk about coffee, about the day ahead, about a funny dream. We built a wall of morning after normalcy around the profound intimacy of the night before. The silence on this one topic was immense, a towering, invisible structure we were both committed to maintaining. It was a fragile truce, a denial we were both complicit in. He needed the comfort, and I needed him. And so the ritual continued, a silent dance of need and fear, night after night, in the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the heaven of his closeness and the hell of its ambiguity. I didn't know how long I could survive there. Then came the day in the garage, the day of the hook. It was months after the breakup, well into a winter that had settled deep into the city's bones. The ritual of our nights had become so ingrained it felt almost normal, a new kind of domesticity we had built without ever defining its terms. I was at the shop, waiting for him to finish up so we could grab dinner. I was leaning against a workbench, watching him work on the engine of an old muscle car, my camera in my hands out of habit. He was trying to loosen a bolt deep in the engine bay, his arm contorted at an awkward angle. With a final, frustrated grunt, his wrench slipped, and his knuckles scraped hard against a sharp edge of metal. He swore, pulling his hand back quickly. It was a nasty gash, bleeding freely, another scar to add to the collection that already mapped his hands. I put my camera down and went to the first aid kit, grabbing antiseptic wipes and bandages. I took his hand in mine, my touch gentle as I cleaned the wound. His hands, which I had only ever seen as instruments of force and function, felt surprisingly vulnerable in mine. The skin was rough, calloused, but beneath it, the structure was just bone and tendon, as fragile as anyone's. He was quiet as I worked, his eyes fixed on our hands. I was focused on the task, carefully cleaning the grease and blood away from the cut. "You're good at this," he murmured, his voice low. "You have steady hands." I just nodded, concentrating on wrapping the bandage securely around his knuckles. When I was done, I started to pull my hands away, but he didn't let go. His fingers tightened slightly around my wrist. I looked up at him, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen before. It was unguarded, intensely focused, a look of profound and confusing inquiry. He used his thumb to wipe away a small smear of grease I'd missed on my own wrist, his touch sending a jolt of electricity up my arm. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate, it stole the air from my lungs. My heart started that familiar, frantic rhythm, a panicked bird against my ribs. He still held my wrist, his gaze unwavering. With his other hand, the one I had just bandaged, he reached out and pressed his palm flat against my chest. The contact was a shock to my system. It wasn't a push or a shove or any kind of casual gesture. It was a placement, deliberate, solid. His palm was warm, and I could feel the slight roughness of the bandage through my shirt. He was holding me there, his hand covering the exact spot where my heart was trying to beat its way out of my body. We stood like that for a few seconds that stretched into an eternity. The sounds of the garage, the buzz of an overhead light, the drip of oil into a pan, the distant hum of traffic, faded into a dull, distant roar. My entire universe had shrunk to the single point of contact between his palm and my chest. His eyes never left mine. He was looking at me, but it felt like he was listening to something else entirely. He was listening to the frantic, undeniable proof of what his proximity did to me, a truth my body was screaming even as my lips remained silent. A faint, sad smile touched his lips, an expression of discovery and resignation. Then, as slowly as he had placed it there, he removed his hand. He let go of my wrist. The spell was broken. "We should go get that dinner," he said, his voice a little rough. He turned away, breaking the intensity of the moment, and started cleaning his tools as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A line had been crossed. The unspoken had been given a voice, not through words, but through a simple, profound touch. He had felt my heart race. He had acknowledged it, and he hadn't pulled away in disgust or confusion. He had held his hand there, feeling it, and he had smiled. The carefully constructed fiction of our friendship, the plausible deniability of our nights. It had all just been shattered by the gentle pressure of his hand. The door hadn't just swung open. He had walked right through it. I stood there, my own hand now covering the spot where his had been, feeling the ghost of his warmth, and I knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. That night, the ritual felt different. The air in my apartment was charged with the memory of the garage, thick with a new, acknowledged tension. We went through the motions, the movie, the soft lighting, the shared space on the couch, but the foundation beneath us had shifted. The ambiguity that had once been a source of anxiety for me now felt like a shared secret, a language we were both suddenly, tentatively, fluent in. When it was time for bed, the walk down the hallway to my room felt like a procession. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of the question his gesture had asked, and the answer my heart had given. We lay down in the bed, the familiar space between us now feeling like a charged magnetic field. For a long time, we just lay there, on our backs, the darkness a thick blanket over us. I could feel him thinking. I could feel the restless energy coming off him in waves. Finally, he turned onto his side to face me. I couldn't see his expression clearly in the gloom, only the dark shape of him, the glint of moonlight in his eyes. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah." I whispered back, my throat tight. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him swallow. "Today, in the shop," he paused again, searching for the words. "Your heart was, it was going crazy." It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, an observation. I couldn't deny it. He had felt it. The proof was undeniable. "I know," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He moved a little closer, the mattress dipping with his weight. His hand came up and rested on my arm, his touch gentle. "It does that a lot, doesn't it?" he asked, his voice soft with a dawning understanding. When I'm close, this was it. The moment of truth. The precipice I had been living on for months. I could lie. I could create a new fiction, blame it on caffeine or stress. I could try to rebuild the walls he had just dismantled. Or I could take a breath and leap. I thought of all the nights I had spent lying awake next to him, aching with a love I was too afraid to name. I thought of the profound loneliness that lived alongside the profound comfort of his presence. And I thought of his hand on my chest, the gentle, knowing pressure of it. He already knew. He was just asking me to admit it. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking just a little. "It does." The confession hung in the air between us, a fragile, glittering thing. He didn't say anything for a long time. His thumb began to draw slow, soothing circles on my arm. The motion was hypnotic, calming the frantic bird in my chest. I could feel him wrestling with something, the gears of his own heart and mind turning slowly, trying to align with this new, startling piece of information. I held my breath, waiting for the verdict, waiting for the apology, the gentle rejection, the beginning of the end of our friendship. Instead, he moved even closer, until his face was just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my lips. "Leo," he whispered again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "Would it be okay?" He trailed off, but I knew the rest of the question. I knew what he was asking. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me the power. And in that moment, all the fear, all the anxiety, all the carefully constructed walls, they all just dissolved into nothing. There was only him, here, in the dark, asking for permission to cross the final threshold. "Yes," I breathed. It would be okay. The kiss was not what I had expected. It wasn't a moment of explosive passion or a desperate, hungry claiming. It was impossibly, achingly gentle. It was a question. His lips met mine with a soft, hesitant pressure, a tentative exploration in the dark. It was a search for confirmation, a testing of this new, fragile reality. I responded with equal softness, a quiet answer to his quiet question. It was a kiss that spoke of confusion and curiosity, of fear and a deep, burgeoning tenderness. It was a confession, whispered in the silent language of touch. In that kiss, I could feel all the loneliness of his past few months, his search for an anchor, and the startling, unexpected discovery that he might have found it in the most unlikely of places. It lasted only a few moments, but it was a conversation that changed everything. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. We stayed like that, just breathing the same air, our eyes closed, the world outside my bedroom window ceasing to exist. The ritual was broken, and in its place, something new, terrifying, and beautiful had just begun. The morning after was a brutal return to reality. I woke up to an empty space beside me. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow, the sheets were still warm, but Julian was gone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized me. On the kitchen counter was a hastily scrawled note on a napkin. Had to get to the shop early. See you later. There was no mention of the night before, no acknowledgement of the kiss that had felt like a seismic event. It was the kind of note he would have left on any other morning, a dispatch from the land of our old normalcy. But this wasn't any other morning. I read the words over and over, trying to decipher a hidden meaning that wasn't there. See you later. It was a casual promise, but it felt like a lie. The beautiful, fragile thing that had been born in the darkness felt like it might not survive the harsh light of day. He didn't come over that night, or the next. My texts went unanswered for hours, and when he finally replied, his messages were short, perfunctory. Busy at the shop. Swamped. They were plausible excuses, but they were a flimsy shield for the avoidance I could feel radiating from him across the city. The silence from him was a physical presence in my apartment. The couch seemed too big, the bedroom too empty. The quiet that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a punishment, an echoing void where his presence used to be. The pain was a cold, heavy thing in my chest. I had allowed myself to hope, and this was the price. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss hadn't been a beginning. It had been a moment of grief-fueled confusion, an aberration he now deeply regretted. I had broken our friendship by wanting more, by admitting I wanted more. The observer had stepped into the frame, and in doing so, had ruined the entire composition. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any rejection. I needed to hear it from him. I needed to face the wreckage, to understand the extent of the damage so I could begin the impossible work of trying to salvage what was left. I drove to the garage late in the afternoon, my stomach in knots. The familiar smell of oil and metal did nothing to soothe me. He was there, under the hood of a car, his back to the door. He didn't hear me come in. I watched him for a moment, the familiar sight of him at work, and my heart ached with a grief so profound it felt like I was mourning a death. Julian, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He flinched, startled, and pulled his head out from under the hood. When he saw me, his face shuddered. The easy smile, the open expression, it was all gone, replaced by a guarded, anxious look. He wiped his hands on a rag, a nervous, fidgety movement. Hey, he said, not meeting my eyes. Didn't know you were stopping by, you've been busy, I said, the words coming out flatter, more accusatory than I intended. Yeah, this engine is a nightmare, he said, gesturing vaguely at the car, seizing the easy excuse I had offered him. He was hiding in the familiar territory of his work, using it as a shield. I couldn't let him. I had to tear it down. We need to talk, I said, my voice low but firm. About the other night, he finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, cornered panic. Leo, he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It was a mistake. The word mistake landed like a punch to the gut. It was exactly what I had feared, but hearing it spoken aloud was a unique and devastating kind of pain. All the air went out of me. But then, a spark of anger ignited in the hollow space. Anger at his cowardice. Anger on behalf of the man who had laid his heart bare in the darkness of his bedroom. A mistake, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. What part was the mistake, Julian? Asking. Or was it the part where I said yes? He flinched again, looking away. It's not like that. I'm a mess right now. I just broke up with Sarah. I don't know what I'm doing. It wasn't fair to you. I was using you, don't you dare, I said, stepping closer, my voice rising. Don't you dare try to hide behind that. And don't you dare diminish what I feel for you by calling it something you can use. I am not a tool you picked up by accident. I took a breath, forcing myself to be calm, to be honest. I have been in love with you for years, Julian. Silently, patiently. I was content to be your friend, because I valued that more than anything. But you changed the terms. You came to my house every night. You slept in my bed. You fell asleep in my arms. You put your hand on my chest, and you felt what you do to me. And then you kissed me. That was your choice. So don't you stand there and tell me it was a mistake, as if it was some meaningless, drunken accident. It meant something. It had to mean something. So I'm asking you, right now, to be honest with me. Not because I expect anything from you, but because after everything, I deserve the truth. Did it mean nothing to you? My confession, my anger, my pain. It was all laid bare on the greasy floor of his garage. There was nowhere left for him to hide. He stared at me, his face a mask of conflict and misery. The silence stretched on, thick and unbearable. He looked broken, lost. He leaned back against the car, as if his own legs could no longer support him. Finally, he spoke, his voice ragged, broken. No, he whispered, shaking his head. It didn't mean nothing. That's what scares me. It's the only thing that's felt real in months. And it terrifies me. I don't know how to be this person, Leo. The person who feels this way about his best friend. About a man. I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself. His confession was a mirror of my own, a declaration of feeling wrapped in layers of fear and confusion. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of himself. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, weary empathy. He was just as lost as I was, just navigating a different part of the same uncharted wilderness. I closed the remaining space between us, and, for the first time, I was the one to initiate the touch. I reached out and gently took his greasy hand in mine. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Then we can be terrified together, I said softly. You don't have to know how to be that person today. You just have to not run away. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He squeezed my hand, a silent, desperate acknowledgement. The confrontation was over. The conflict was not. But we were finally standing on the same side of it. The resolution wasn't a sudden, cinematic epiphany. It was a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. It was quiet conversations that lasted late into the night, filled with hesitant questions and honest, fumbling answers. Julian had to dismantle a version of himself he had accepted for his entire life. And I had to learn to trust that the ground beneath my feet was real, not a dream from which I would violently awaken. He started talking about Sarah, not just the pain of the breakup, but the reality of their relationship. He spoke of a quiet, persistent feeling of being unseen, of playing a role that fit him but was not truly him. He confessed that in the quiet of my apartment, with me, he felt a sense of peace and recognition he hadn't realized was missing from his life. He was seeing himself for the first time through my eyes, through the lens of my camera and the safety of my friendship, and the image staring back was one he was only just beginning to understand. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. The ambiguity was gone, replaced by a quiet, deliberate tenderness. The first time he stayed over again, there was no pretext. He came to my door, not with the exhaustion of an escapee, but with the quiet purpose of someone coming home. When we went to bed, he reached for my hand in the dark, his fingers lacing through mine. There was no accidental cuddling, no plausible deniability. He turned to me, pulled me close, and held me, his touch now a statement, not a question. It was a conscious choice, a declaration of presence. And in his arms, for the first time, I felt no anxiety, no frantic analysis. The frantic bird in my chest was finally still, its wings folded in a state of profound and absolute peace. I was no longer just a harbor for his grief. I was his destination. We created new rituals. Morning coffee, sitting at my small kitchen table, our knees brushing under it. Him, trying to explain the intricate logic of an engine. Me, trying to explain the elusive magic of capturing light on film. We learned the topography of each other's lives in a new way. I spent more time at the garage, not just as an observer, but as a partner, handing him tools, cleaning parts, just being there. He spent more time in my darkroom, watching in silent fascination as images of his own face, his own hands, emerged from the blank paper in the chemical bath, a kind of magic he could finally appreciate. We were developing a new picture of us, one where the lines were clear, the focus was sharp, and the composition finally felt right. The door between our worlds, once just ajar, was now wide open, and we moved freely between them. One Saturday morning, months later, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. I found Julian standing at the stove, wearing an old t-shirt of mine, flipping pancakes. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, catching the lines of his face. He turned and saw me, and the smile he gave me was open, easy, and completely unguarded. It was the smile I had first seen across a hot parking lot, but it was different now. It was deeper, richer, a smile meant only for me. He didn't say anything. He just gestured with his spatula to a waiting plate. I walked over to him, wrapped my arms around his waist from behind, and rested my head against his back. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against my cheek. He leaned his head back against mine, and we stood there for a long moment, a comfortable, domestic silence enveloping us, the pancakes sizzling forgotten on the stove. It was a moment of such simple, profound rightness that it almost made me want to cry. It was ordinary. It was a Tuesday, no, a Saturday morning. And it was everything. We learned to measure our lives in moments, in the snapshots our memory chooses to keep. We think the important ones are the big ones, the graduations, the first jobs, the grand declarations. But the truth is, the foundation of a life is built from smaller, quieter things. It's built from late-night conversations and shared silences, from the comfort of a familiar presence in the dark. It's built from 1,000 tiny gestures of trust and care. My life with Julian wasn't built on a lightning strike, but on the slow, patient accumulation of these quiet moments. It began in the space between us on a couch, in the unspoken question of a hand on a chest, in the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of a whispered yes in the dark. We didn't fall into love. We built it, piece by piece, with steady hands, until we had created a shelter that was strong enough to house us both, a quiet place where we could finally, truly, be home.